Hello, we're in our workbook, Unit 1. We've just read Everyday Use. And we have two connected pieces of nonfiction that we're going to read. So if you please look here, we're going to look at What's in a Name? The History of African American Naming Practices. That's a book excerpt. And we're going to look at African American Quilting, a long, rich heritage. And that's an online article. So, What's in a Name? The History of African American Naming Practices, which is a book excerpt, and African American Quilting, a long, rich heritage. So, what's the connection? In everyday use, Dee and Mama find different ways to show respect for their cultural heritage. Dee changes her name to reflect her identity, while Mama instead puts family heirlooms to good use. Names do provide an important link to our ancestry, says Kina Fileta in What's in a Name? The History of African American Naming Practices. In this book excerpt, she summarizes the long history of African American names. The article, African American Quilting, a Long Rich Heritage, explores the history of quilting and its connections to African roots. So before we begin, let's chart it. What does your name tell about you? Complete the chart below and tell what you know about your own name. So what is your full name? Does your name reflect your cultural heritage? Do you have a nickname that's more you than your real name? Does your name refer to an ancestor of yours or a relative? Was your name chosen simply because your parents liked it? Does your name have a special meaning? What is that? Okay, so that's the background. Now this is an excerpt from a book. Before we read, what is your purpose for reading? Well, obviously you're going to answer some questions about it. You're going to make a connection to what we've just read. Strong readers survey or preview before they read. So let's do that. Flip through the pages and what do you notice? How is it organized? Do you notice headings? Read through those headings. What does it tell you? Put a number next to each of the headings. So I would call this the introduction. I would call it number 1. That would be number 2. Keep going. You'll see a note right here that tells you as you read, stripped of their identity, underline words and phrases that describe key ideas that relate to this. So as we read that section, everything that has to do with identity or losing identity, we would underline. Okay. Are we ready to read? Have we numbered? Great. I might leave some words out. Please fill them in. The History of African American Naming Practices by Kina Fileta. Your name is more than just a way for others to identify you. It reflects your family, history, and your heritage. It may even shape your personality. Think about how you would feel if a stranger suddenly gave you a different name, one that you didn't choose and that had no connection to the name your parents gave you. That's exactly what happened to African Americans during slavery. The naming traditions of African Americans reflect a turbulent history, a troubled history. The first generations of enslaved Africans brought to America during the Middle Passage in the 16th century were forced to accept new names given to them by slave owners. These names distanced them from their homeland and linked them with the brutal practice of slavery. When African Americans achieved freedom in the 19th century, they were finally able to choose their own names, but they faced difficult decisions about what those names should be. Later, influenced by the civil rights movement, many African Americans sought to reconnect with the continent they left behind, Africa, right, by embracing names reflective of their African heritage. We see the triangle. Let's pause. Clarify and summarize. Circle the phrase in the third paragraph that tells when African Americans regained the right to choose their own names. You'll see it here. And that would be after the Civil War, 1865. Write a sentence or two that summarize the ideas of the third paragraph. So quickly, I hope you notice that we have traditions, we have dates. So what would we call this? This paragraph is the history of African American names, the background information. Section 2. Stripped of their identity. When Africans were brought to America, their enslavers, the people who made them slaves, their enslavers, tried to take not only their freedom, but also their identity. Slave traders usually gave the Africans new names as soon as they brought them onto the slave ships. Often the first two slaves aboard were renamed Adam and Eve, after the first man and woman in the Bible. Africans who survived the treacherous, everyone say treacherous, treacherous, positive or negative? Okay, treacherous, horrible, months-long voyage on the ship, received yet another new name upon arrival in America. Slave owners frequently gave their new charges, the people they're in charge of, their charges, names. They frequently gave them names with historical or familial significance. Short, simple American names such as Tom, Hank, Joe, and John were popular. These were often shortened versions of the slave owner's own family names. Some slave owners drew from the Bible, choosing names such as Abraham, Jacob, Mary, or Sarah. Others turned to Greek and Roman culture and selected names such as Titus, Marcus, or Caesar. Slave owners may have selected classical names in part to link America's slave culture with that of ancient Greece and Rome, because those were societies that also practiced slavery. In addition to their first names, enslaved African Americans also lost their family names. Most received new last names, linking them with their owners. Wealthy, land-owning families with English surnames. And what's a surname? We go down to the bottom. A surname is a person's family name or last name. So most received new last names linking them with their owners, such as White, Jackson, or Johnson. When an enslaved person was sold to a new owner, he or she was given a new surname. This practice has made African American family lines extremely difficult to trace. Records detailing childbirths and marriages between enslaved people do exist, but without common surnames to connect family members. Kinship, who are you related to? Who are your kin? Kinship remains difficult to piece together. And this is a sharecropper in Little Rock, Arkansas, around 1935. And this is about the time of the setting of everyday use. The name of freedom. Before Emancipation, many escaped or freed slaves took new names that represented freedom. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, so you see historical names and a Greek name, well, a Roman name, Caesar Augustus. The famous abolitionist, we know him now as Frederick Douglass, adopted his new last name after running away from slavery in Maryland. Sojourner Truth, everyone say Sojourner, Truth, okay. The crusader for African American freedom and women's rights, wasn't born with her remarkable name. Until age 20, she was simply known as Isabella. She took on her new symbolic name after a vision in a dream prompted her to speak out in favor of the freedom of her people. After the 13th Amendment abolished, which means outlawed, got rid of, after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, newly freed African Americans struggled with what to call themselves. Most had families that went back generations in America and had lost all ties to their African ancestors. Some kept the last names given to them, or that linked to the white family with whom they had spent most of their lives. Others took the last names of former presidents like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who had freed their slaves in their wills, or the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. Return to African roots. During the 1960s civil rights movement, many African Americans began rejecting what they considered their slave name, the last name given to them by slave owners, in favor of names that reflected a growing sense of racial pride. The African American leader, Malcolm X, began life as Malcolm Little. The X was meant to symbolize his rejection of the family name originating with white slave owners. It also represented the X many enslaved people were branded with, what was burned into their skin on their upper arms. He later adopted the Muslim name. Perhaps the most well-known African American to change his name during this period was heavyweight boxing champion Cassius Clay. When he became Muhammad Ali, he told interviewers he no longer wanted to be identified by his slave name. And you see Cassius, that's a name from Roman history. African American names today. Today, many African Americans continue to adopt African and African-sounding names to embrace their ancestral culture. Traditional Swahili names such as Ashanti, Tariq, and Lakeisha have become common names for African Americans. We see a triangle. Let's pause. You can use another word with a similar base to help you determine the meaning of an unfamiliar word. An ancestor is someone from an earlier generation of a family. Using this information, what do you think ancestral means? It says circle the word ancestral. So the culture that belonged to their ancestors from generations before. Continuing. Other contemporary, that means right now, contemporary African American names may not be traditionally African, Beyonce, Lakeda, but they have letter patterns and sound combinations more common in Africa, so they sound African. Names like these reflect African Americans' attempt to weave together, to combine two cultural influences, that of Africa and that of the United States. Although common among African Americans today also common among African Americans today are names associated with the Islamic faith, which was practiced by many enslaved Africans and remains prominent in Africa today. Popular Muslim names include Khalid, Rashid, and Malik. Sometimes these names are feminized or made into girls' names by adding an A at the end. Khalida, Rashida, Malika. A popular example of this is the name Rashida. And we see a triangle here. Let's pause. We're being asked to go back to the sections that you numbered. Use the details you underlined to write a statement that summarizes Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, Section 4. So in essence, what is that section about? Be sure to look at the name for clues. A second related nonfiction article connecting to everyday use is called African American Quilting, A Long, Rich Heritage by Judy Ann Johnson Breenman. Okay, so before we read, we preview the text features. We see this picture, the title, caption. Okay, we see our headings. Let's read through these and see what information we can glean. What will this article be about? Okay, and let's read. I will leave some words out. Please fill in the blanks. African American Quilting, A Long, Rich Heritage by Judy Ann Johnson Breenman. Lizzie Alexander mends the Red Cross quilt she made to commemorate to commemorate a 1927 flood, meaning people probably lost their lives and the Red Cross was there to help. Okay. African American quilting is almost as old as the history of America. Black slave women were needed for spinning, weaving, sewing, and quilting on plantations, which is a very large farm, and in other wealthy households. Okay, we see the triangle. Let's pause. Okay, look over the headings to get an idea of what information you'll read. And as you read, underline words and phrases that describe the main points under each heading. African American quilts in early America. Although the quilt fabrics and patterns used were those of upper-class whites, some African American women became highly skilled in creating these quilts. Little time was left in the day for these slave women to do their own sewing. We know some made scrap quilts or other bed coverings for their families, but none survived to be studied today. Life after Emancipation. After the Civil War, many African American women went to work in households as domestics. Domestics means working in the house, such as the maid, the personal cook. Okay, so after the Civil War, so they're no longer slaves, they're free, many went to work in households as domestics, while others helped out on small farms. It was still a difficult life of working from dawn to dusk. When the sun comes up, the sun goes down. Quilts were made for everyday use out of necessity. They needed blankets, scraps, discarded clothing, and feed sacks, like bags used for feeding the animals corn, for example. Those were the materials used. In making string quilts, strips of various fabrics were sewn together. The result was then cut into blocks and made into a quilt. Sadly, we have few examples of quilts made by African Americans during this period because of the heavy wear they received, the everyday use, so they didn't survive. Okay. Possible African roots, the history. Some intriguing theories have been proposed that link African American women's quilting to their African roots. Strip construction, this idea of using strips of fabric, large-scale designs, strong contrasting colors, blue next to orange, yellow next to purple, and variations from symmetrical patterns all appear to reflect textile fabric patterns found in parts of Africa. Let's read that sentence again from here. Read with me. Strip construction, large-scale designs, strong contrasting colors, and variations from symmetrical patterns all appear to reflect textile patterns found in parts of Africa. In studying the roots of African American quilts, the difficulty lies in the fact that few documented quilts remain. Story quilts, such as the biblical story quilts made by Harriet Powers, lead us to wonder if many other such quilts were made by African American women. As Harriet Powers was born a slave in 1837, we might assume this art dates back some time. We do know this technique of creating a story with applique, so sewing pieces onto the quilt, applying them applique, has been handed down through the generations. These folk quilts are still made by African American women today. We see a triangle. The word applique refers to a method of cutting pieces of fabric and sewing them to the surface of a quilt. Circle the most likely root word for applique: apple, apply, appeal, or apparent, and explain your choice. African American quilts, unique or not? And unique means one of a kind or not. Quilt historians have found that, for the most part, Black women made their quilts in the same styles that were popular with the general population during any given period. As quilters draw from a common history, one cannot look at a quilt and easily identify the cultural background of the artist. There has always been a great deal of overlapping in quilting styles among different communities and cultures. So is it unique? Not so much. To add to the confusion, economic status, poor, middle class, rich, economic status usually determined the kinds of quilts made by women regardless of their cultural heritage. Poorer women have always had to make do with scraps and discarded clothing. White and Black women alike found string quilting to be an efficient way to use this fabric. Underline the words and phrases in the section that tell whether quilts are unique. So are they unique or not unique? Tends to be saying they're not unique. So where does it tell us that? Go ahead and underline that and then sum it up in a sentence. African American quilting today. Still, it's hard to imagine that heritage hasn't had an impact on African American quilts. Surely their common experiences affected the taste of early African American quilters, and there is no doubt that Black women today are making striking quilts that reflect African culture. And now we're taking those two readings together, okay? And we have 8 questions. And we're not going to do this one right now. So just focus on these 8 questions.